Hi, everybody, and welcome back to JenTalks. As promised, this is part one of a three-part series on trauma. And what I'd really like to achieve is to teach you a little bit about how the mind and the physical body and the energy body is affected by trauma. So I'm going to start with my favorite understanding or definition. It's not taken quote unquote, but it's just an understanding of what trauma is. So there's a huge kind of misperception about trauma from the point of view of, trauma is the story of what happens to you, that something traumatic has to have happened to you for you to say that you've experienced trauma. I've yet to meet a person who has not experienced trauma in their life, but it's not the story of what has happened. It is actually what we call the current imprint that's left behind through fear or horror or I suppose pain. That's the imprint that's left behind based on what has happened. So what we mean by that is if something that could happen to me mightn't be the slightest bit traumatic based on my environment or my beliefs or my upbringing or my behavior. And yet somebody else in the same position might feel extremely traumatized by something very similar. Now, there are common things that traumatize people. For example, our threat to our own existence, the threat to the livelihood or the health of our loved ones. There's common threads that create trauma in people, but it doesn't necessarily mean that every single event that happens to you that's unpleasant is necessarily traumatic. Traumatic is how it affects you and how it imprints into your nervous system, and it remains there, and it leaves a stain or a shadow of fear or horror or pain. And that completely changes not just the nervous system, but the whole shape of the brain, how the brain is formed, which I'm going to talk about. And it also affects our behavior and even the way we process information. So just before we move into how it changes us, I just want to talk about there are different categories of trauma. So people talk about trauma like all trauma is equal. And I suppose there's just to differentiate, we have acute trauma, which is something that happens, where there's a once off, maybe you've been in a car crash or there's something, you've witnessed something horrific and it has affected you, that it could lead to trauma and even something like post-traumatic stress disorder. And then we have chronic trauma, where we have something that happens over and over again. So it's a repeat of the experience. It's not just one acute event that happens. And then after that, then we also have what's called complex trauma. Complex trauma is usually a combination of acute and chronic trauma together, that you might have an acute event, but then you also might have a complex event as well. So, for example, there may be like a sudden loss in the family. And then on top of that, you also might have some sort of, say, domestic abuse that's happening over and over again. And that causes it then to become complex. There's a couple of more different levels of, or different, I suppose, differentiations or different categories of trauma. And another one of the categories is systematic. So systematic is something that happens in the system. So maybe, for people that might have been in care, maybe even in the healthcare system, that something happened to them while they're being in care. And then we have vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma is usually the trauma that happens to the people in the front line that are involved, those people that are suffering from trauma. So they're just really for you to understand that there are different categories. It doesn't really matter for the point of view of this talk for you to understand which one you might fall into. It's just for people to understand that trauma can happen to you witnessing trauma in someone else, as well as you being subjected to your own trauma. So, and also where trauma might have come from. Now, I will talk further on in the talks about intergenerational trauma, where trauma has been coded into your DNA from previous generations. And we know through epigenetics that that's a scientific fact that can actually happen. But we won't be going into that in a big way in this three-part series. I will be coming back to that in a separate series. But for these three parts, what I really want to get across is, first of all, what trauma is. I've just given you a definition of it there, or a kind of an understanding of it, that there are different categories of it. And then more importantly, what I'd like to share with you for this talk is how trauma affects the brain. So the trauma affects the brain in 4 different ways. And you don't necessarily have to have post-traumatic stress disorder to experience these. So sometimes people may recognize these differences in their cognitive function, and they think it might be down to some sort of damage that they have, but it's just to understand that the brain actually changes shape once trauma takes effect. So I'm going to start with a little rewind and talk about, first of all, how trauma enters the body, then how it changes the brain. And the great news is that everything that happens in the brain can also be undone. So nothing I'm going to say tonight should be alarming to you. If anything, I want to reassure you that if you recognize any of these traits in yourself, then you can understand that we'll also get to the part in the next coming weeks where we can learn tools and tips to reverse the damage or the changes in the brain. Really, I suppose the damage is an incorrect word, to reverse the changes in the brain that have happened through trauma. And so the first thing is to say that how trauma enters the body, like every experience we have, it enters through our 5 senses. We have our sight, smell, sound, taste, and touch. And all of their information, all of that raw data is taken in and sent into the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the biggest nerve in the body. It starts at our very end of our tailbone, and it travels all the way up through our digestive tract, all the way through, right through the split of our diaphragm, up around past our lungs, up either side of our neck, which is why we have that gorgeous sensitivity in our neck. It enters in behind our ears, into the back of our brain, and into what's called the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system looks after our automatic nervous system and also the parts of the body that are not automatic. In other words, like our lungs, we can breathe automatically most of the time, but we can also control it on occasion when we want to. So that's what the autonomic nervous system is. That's an example of that. So why that's important is because when trauma enters the body and it enters into the autonomic nervous system, that communicates with the central nervous system, which determines how we're feeling and what's going on with us and what state we should be in. So we're usually flicking between what's known as our fight and flight response to our non-stress response, which is known as our rest and digest response. So when we're in fight or flight, that's what kicks off as soon as we get frightened or threatened in any way. If the amygdala part of the brain, which is the reptile part of the brain, feels any way under threat, it goes into panic and it goes into attack, and it sends beautiful cortisol and adrenaline all through the body. It fills our organs with blood so that we could be stronger and we could be faster and we can prepare to fight. Our heart pumps faster, our breath moves more slowly. So that's amazing for what we need in that moment. But what happens to us when trauma happens is that we get stuck in the stress response. And when we get stuck in the stress response, what 4 things happen in the brain? The amygdala, which should really shut down after a stress response, remains active, and it actually increases in size and it becomes more dominant than it should be. Then what happens is the other part, the hippocampus part of the brain, which would be the emotional part, that actually begins to shrink. So we start to shut down. It also looks after our short-term memory. So it starts to shut down, and it actually gets a little bit mixed up about things that have been in the future, past and present. That's why when people have post-traumatic stress, they have flashbacks. Our memory starts to flag, our ability to correlate emotions and to, I suppose, regulate our emotions becomes reduced. It also makes a stronger connection with the amygdala, so they become very much in tie with each other. They're like a little tag team. Like the amygdala is firing off neurons, and then the hippocampus is picking them up. Then what happens is the prefrontal cortex, which is the logical thinking part of our mind, that also begins to shrink. And when we don't use part of our brain, what happens is those parts of our cells start to shrink and die off. And then last but not least, our central nervous system gets stuck in like hyperactivity. So when the central nervous system is in the overall nervous system is in hyperactivity, like anything, we become drained. And when we become drained, we become worn out. We become, our sleep patterns get affected. Our energy levels flag. Our focus, everything reduces. Because think about it, when you're absolutely exhausted, that's what happens when your nervous system is just on full throttle all of the time. Now, the beauty of all of those 4 changes is they are all completely reversible. And I will be talking furthermore. I mean, I'm not going to leave you hanging tonight and say, well, how can we change them? Very, very quickly, and I will be talking about this in greater detail, is it's been scientifically proven on an MRI scan that under MRI, we can identify the difference between a brain that has experienced mindfulness, where the hippocampus has grown and the prefrontal cortex has grown and the amygdala is actually reduced due to mindfulness exercises. And I'm going to talk to you more about really simple exercises that you can implement into your life every single day without any difficulty. And I'm also going to talk to you about breath work. I'm going to talk to you about CBT. I'm going to talk to you about EFT, so cognitive behavioral therapy, emotional freedom technique, which is tapping. Tapping videos are already on my channel. And I'll be talking about loads of different tools and techniques, all of which are free and accessible, and all of which are accessible on my channel. So there's no need to look, any further unless you wish to. So it's all at your feet. And the reason why I wanted to share, I suppose, about the changes in the brain is I meet people all of the time that are stuck in the stress response, but they don't realize they're stuck in the stress response. They think that they're just overly anxious people, or they're fearful people, or they're just naturally like this, and their brain doesn't work as well as they wanted to, and they actually put it down to their own, I suppose, limitations. And actually all it is that trauma has been trapped in the body. It gets trapped in other parts of the body, which I'll be talking about next week. But today we're just talking about the brain and how the brain changes. And trauma affects all of your body in lots of different ways. And also when our nervous system is in that overdrive, because we're wearing the body down, it leads to illness. And the biggest illness that the most commonly recognized illnesses that are linked to the central nervous system being on overload is autoimmune disease. So I won't even go into that tonight because that's too much information just for this short video, but I will be talking about it throughout the weeks. And if you want to look up any information on that, 100% Gabor Mate is the guy to Google or to look up on YouTube. His movie, The Wisdom of Trauma, talks all about that as well. But just to say that if you are recognizing these symptoms, the first thing I want you to take away from that is it's not you. You weren't born dysfunctional. There's nothing wrong with you. You're not inadequate. It's trauma that you've experienced either in this lifetime or you've inherited from a previous lifetime, because it is possible. And that once we know that we are dealing with trauma and we can be aware of it, then we can start to heal it. You cannot heal what you cannot see. So now that we know that we can identify it, now we can begin to heal. So next week, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start very quickly with just a little overrun on how else the body is affected by trauma. And then we're going to move straight into how we can overcome the effects of trauma on the body. So I'm well over my time tonight. I usually try and stick to 10 minutes, but I could talk for the week on trauma, which I won't. And I will be back here next Tuesday, again on JenTalks, talking about trauma and how to overcome the effects of trauma. And if any of this has resonated with you and you wish to send me a question or post a comment underneath, please feel free to do so. If you want to do it in confidence, you'll find me on any of my social media channels, and I'll address that in confidence on the talk next week, or I'll reply back to you directly, whatever you prefer. So thank you again for following me and for liking and subscribing and for listening to JenTalks every week. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing you back here next week. Hope you all have a fantastic week. Take care and talk to you all very soon. Thanks again for connecting, as always. Bye for now.